Hello and welcome everybody to a new video. So in this video we're going to be talking about how I made this generative art using some handcrafted AI software and my CNC machine. So let's go. Now this might seem pretty basic for AI generated art, and well, that's because it is. However, with my system anyone can generate a totally unique piece to them using AI that is more or less autonomous. So our process all starts here with this blank canvas that you see in front of you. The idea with this was that I wanted a really simple basic user interface that the user could interact with to effectively generate a data set that we would then train an AI model on to start the whole generative process for our art piece. Once the user has clicked around and generated whatever kind of cloud pattern of dots they want, they can go and they can click the model button down the bottom here, and that's where the magic really starts to happen. So in the background at this point, we take all those points that the user has clicked and we send it into a machine learning model, which performs something called polynomial regression to try and fit a curve to it, which roughly approximates what the data is. Don't worry if most of those words don't make a lot of sense to you. Effectively, what you see is the red dots that get generated are the AI's best attempt at coming up with some mathematical formula that matches the data that the user put in. So you can see down the bottom there, we have a formula, y is equal to some big mess, and you can see this average percentage error as well, which indicates in this case that it's not a particularly good fit to the data. So if you were a data scientist churning this out, this wouldn't be a very good model that you've generated. But for our purposes, all we're interested in is kind of how funky the curve can be. Of course, you can find all the code for this on my GitHub, which is github.com/carey3. I'll leave a link down in the description. The next step in the process is to generate the G-code. At this point, the AI is all finished with. Once we've generated our data set, it's just heuristics that go in here now to generate the rest of the pattern that the CNC machine is going to engrave. In this case, it's pretty simple. What we do is we take each point and we use that point to draw an arrow. When you stitch all the arrows together, they form this sort of curve which each arrow is pointing into each other in the direction that the curve is moving. You can see here, this is how that curve will actually end up getting engraved by the CNC machine. And as you can see, the pattern is pretty simple. There's nothing too complicated about it. But effectively, what we're showing here is that you can take this seed data that came from the AI model and you can kind of do anything with it. So in this case, this is just a really basic, quick example of what you could do with it, but you could use that data to seed any other type of algorithm then that might generate some kind of crazy patterns for you. In our case, this simple kind of arrow chain is kind of pretty and elegant, and it's also really easy for the CNC machine to engrave. So this brings us to the actual manufacturing. Even though this is AI generated, there is still a human element to it because I have to set up the stock and set up the machine. So the stock here is very thin strips of plywood. In this case, it's not quite the right size, so I just need to dimension it down by cutting it in half basically. Conveniently, you can do this with a razor blade because the stock is so thin and you get a really nice edge from it. And here I'm using my favorite matte black paint to prep some of these pieces. You'll see me use this paint later on to fill in the engraved pieces to make the pattern really pop. In this case, I'm prepping some of these panels by completely coating them in it, which then we will engrave onto, and we'll basically have negative patterns then highlighting, which also looks quite cool. This paint is one of my favorite paints to use. It's really quick drying. It's really cheap. I have no idea where you can get it, but I found it at my local hardware store and it's absolutely fantastic. The finish is wonderful too. Really reminds me of Chinese black ink. Onto the actual engraving now, and because of how light duty all this work is, a fixturing method of just taping everything down works absolutely perfectly here. The algorithm that generates the plan basically works on a 6 by 6 centimeter panel. These sheets are 10 by 10 centimeters, so the only thing I have to do is just find a point about 2 centimeters from the bottom left in both directions, X and Y, and that gives me my start position. In terms of the Y position, I try and position the cutter just slightly pressing into the material. Because this is such light material, it is very forgiving in the depth that you engrave to. Also, by pushing in a little bit more, I kind of ensured that even if there's a portion of the piece that's a little bit higher than the others, hopefully the cutter will still make engagement with it and still engrave the pattern. Because the material is so light, the machine has absolutely no problem engraving this pattern. It chews through it really quickly, and we're left with a really, really nice surface finish, which I'm really happy with. The next step is to highlight the engraving that we did in the last step. So to do that, I'm just using the same paint as I used earlier on, and I'm using a small fine tipped brush just to get the paint right down into the engraved lines. So the trick with this is that you want to put down as much paint as you can, and then you also want to pull off as much paint as you can. So you'll see what I'm doing is I'm getting the paint right down into the grooves, and then I'm using a small rag to wipe away the excess of this. You'll see why later on. It helps with the cleanup at the end of it, but the whole idea is that we want as much paint as possible in the little grooves and as little paint as possible outside them, which will help with our cleanup later on. Whole idea is then that this will just highlight the engraving and really make it pop on the piece. So while that highlighting dries, I have my black stock that I prepared earlier, which is now also fully dry, so I can do an engraving on this, which will give us a cool kind of contrast at the end. You'll see one which is black on white, and then you'll see the other one which is white on black. Just an example of two different finishes. The pattern's the exact same, but you can just see that they look kind of cool. So we're back to our previously highlighted piece. And the last stage here is basically to take a sander with some very light grit sandpaper and to try and remove as much of the excess paint as we can while still leaving all the paint in the engraved areas. The trick here is not to go too deep, as you'll remove some of the engraving. It isn't super deep, the engraving, so if you use a heavy grit sandpaper, you can very easily just sand the entire surface off, and then you won't have anything to show for it. Even still, with the light grit sandpaper, we do actually lose a little bit of definition on the engraving, but because of the black highlighting, it shows up really nicely, and it really does pop here at the end, which I'm a big fan of. And here we have it. These are our final results. I'm really, really happy with how these turned out. I think they look really cool, and you're definitely going to find a few of these dotted around my house. It's kind of funny, I don't really think of myself as a terribly artistic person, but I do think of myself as a creative person, so I really, really love a project like this where I get to bring together a bunch of my kind of random esoteric skills and, you know, bring them to bear on one problem where I can make something kind of cool out of it at the end. What's cool about this is that for every combination of unique dots that the user can click, and also every time the user hits the model button, they're actually getting a completely unique output that will never be created again and has never been seen before. So this is where the kind of personalized part comes into it, that if you give this to a user, you can be pretty much 100% guaranteed that the piece that they're going to generate out of it at the end is going to be completely unique to them and that instant when they did it, which I think is pretty cool. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you found something useful or educational in it, or at least mildly interesting. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, guys, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.